Welcome back to part 2 of our series where we're building a form application using the Pythonnet library. So in our last video, we kind of got some context for what this namespace does. We went over a little bit of the documentation and we basically got a really basic form application up and running. So it's literally just a box with some color and a caption. So nothing fancy. And we kind of talked a little bit about threading. So the idea that we have this message loop that we need to create, and then we kind of add our object to it. Now, I will kind of warn you. Sometimes you feel like you could potentially get conflicting answers as to what is the right approach to a particular topic. So a very common one you might actually find is this whole idea of the run method. Now, on some examples from the Pythonnet library, they explicitly define a run method, right? And they just run the Interop Explorer. So for example, if you remember in the last one, we did this whole little thing where we created an instance of the application object, which is supposed to be our message loop, and then we run it. But with this one, I can technically call it without doing that, right? So that's fine. You might be asking, well, why do you do it the other way? The answer is because that's what the documentation showed, at least from what I can tell. So on one example, they do it that method. So they'll find the run method and then they will just basically do it the way I showed you. And then for this other one, the WordPad one, which seems to be relatively, I think, the same thing, at least from what I can tell, they build all these components in XYZ and everything like that. And they have their thing. But all they do is they just run it as is. So they don't actually define that run method. They just kind of use this windows.form.run.app. And supposedly that seems to work too. So I don't know. I wish I could give you a good answer as to what is the appropriate way of doing it. It seems like each one could kind of maybe be done on its own. So I don't know if there's necessarily an advantage to doing one versus the other. I'm just going to keep it like this. And then, just know there potentially could be other ways and you might see different ways of doing it. It doesn't seem to impact anything from what I can tell, at least at this point. But if it does, I will be the first to tell you. Alrighty. What are we doing? The buttons. The buttons, the buttons, the buttons. There's the buttons. Yes, there's the buttons. All right. So during our initialization process, we're going to create a new button. Now, I will say this. This to me seemed a little bit odd. Everything is kind of here under the initialization process, right? While that's okay, I think it probably might be advantageous to organize it a little bit better. So I'm doing more experimentation on my end. I can't really give you a solid answer if there's technically any implications about this, but I'm really thinking about just defining some methods in my particular form application that will simply create the object and then just return it back during the initialization process. I don't see where that would be an issue, but I haven't tried it. Now, just to keep things consistent for what you're seeing in the documentation to what you're seeing now, I'm going to do everything here under the initialization process, but don't be surprised if down the road I start changing things up and start, hey, well, let's just create a method and do X, Y, Z. So, just keep in mind, you might see different things. Part of it is I personally do it like that because I'm trying to keep it a little bit more organized. And I think if you're trying to do too much under one method, it's kind of confusing. But again, when that point comes, we'll come there. So first thing is we'll define the load button, right? So we'll just define the load button like so. So we need to create a button object. And so we'll say self.loadFileButton. So we're saying, okay, this application, this form object is going to have a control and it's going to be a button object. And so we're going to call these System.Windows.Forms. And then we're going to do the button object. So we're going to create a new instance of our button object. And then we're going to define some attributes about our button. So for example, its location. So define the location of our button. And so we're going to say self.loadFileButton. There is a property called location, and that location can be defined by the System.Drawing Self.point object. And so this one basically defines a point on a plane. So an XY coordinate defines that point. And so from here, it's from the left. So we're going to say 30 points from the left and 500 points down from the top. Sometimes you got to play around with it. Other times there's actually dynamic methods we can leverage. And so I'm kind of still working on those ones, but once I have them ready, I will demonstrate them with another component. But right now, this will just simply place it closer to the bottom. And then we want to make sure that it has a location. It needs to have a size. So define the size of our button. And so we'll say self.loadFile button. And then there's obviously a size property. And there is a System.Drawing. And then we're going to do a size structure. So in this case, it's 256 by 54. Again, in points. Points. There you go. I think that's technically everything we need to kind of show it. So let's see what our form looks like so far. Nothing. Well, that kind of sucks, right? Nothing super helpful if we don't have a button. So we need to, what is the word? We need to actually add it to our particular form. So when we did this, you're going, why is it not showing? Didn't we add it? No, you defined it. You didn't add it. So now we need to define our particular button. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a control to our button, sorry, to our form. So we'll call this the add control. So add controls to our form. Okay, and so what we'll do is we're going to do self.control. So there's a controls collection. This is all the controls on our form. There's an add method, and then we just pass through the control that we want to add. In this case, the control is the button. Now, there's another thing that can be a little bit confusing depending on the documentation that you read. So some define what is called a dispose method. This dispose method is basically going to dispose of all the controls once the form shuts down, right? So it's going to dispose it. And then on top of that, it's going to dispose the actual form itself. Now, what that also means is up here, we need to define a new attribute. So define control container. So we're going to say self sorry. I have to like jump through my notes and sometimes it can be a little bit challenging. At least I think it can be challenging. Where is it? Where is it? You know what? Let's make it easy on myself. Let's just copy the code. So we'll say self.components. So this basically defines a container that contains all of our components that belong to our particular form, right? And so it comes from the system.component model.container. So with that one, what it does is it's going to create that container for us. And then from there, what it will do is it will store our controls in there. And then once it's all done, it will do everything for you. So pretty interesting. What we want to do is once we've defined that container, when our app is done running, we want to dispose of it. So dispose of form and component container. So how do we do that? Well, we call this self.components, and then there is a dispose method that we can call, and so that will dispose of the container for us, which is kind of nice because then we don't have to worry about it. And then on top of that, we need to dispose of our form, right? And so this one's a little bit more tricky. It's not necessarily the same. We're going to do System.Windows.Forms.form. Where is it? Form, and then dispose. And then it's going to take the form itself. Again, I've completely avoided adding the dispose method and I had no issues. So dispose of components. But depending on which example you look at, sometimes they add it, sometimes they don't add it. And so I can't, again, say with 100% confidence if it's going to really impact anything. But in my advice, I just try to be a little bit cautious with it. And so for me, it's an extra like method that's not that long. I'll dispose of it that way. And that way I don't kind of have to think about it in the back of my head and wondering, okay, is it going to potentially ruin something or X, Y, Z? Or is it just going to kind of, do something that's not really super crazy, right? So let's see how it looks after we do all that. So we'll run our Python file and terminal. You can see we now have a button. It's not very pretty, but it's a button. And what we want to do now is we want to make our button look a little bit more presentable, something that's, we can actually say it looks nice. So what we'll do next is we'll define some of the aesthetics behind it. So we'll define the style of our button. And so we'll say self.loadFileButton, and there is this attribute called flat style. And the flat style is basically the overall look of our button. And so if we go to the System.Windows.Forms namespace, there is an enumeration called flat style, and you can pass through flat. Now, I will kind of just give you a heads up. You can do other ways of doing it. You don't have to technically do that whole full path, but I will warn you, it's probably going to be a little bit harder to understand what exactly is changing it and everything like that. So again, there's so many like different objects here, but you can see the enumeration. You can pass through an integer if you want, or you can just pass through the name. You just got to be fully qualified. Right now it's flat. We were at standard. What I could show you is a pop-up version. So we'll first do this one, show you what flat looks like. You can kind of see it's nothing too crazy. Hopefully that's nothing that's gonna bother you. And then we have, what is it? A pop-up. I think that's the next one. Oh, that's not the right one, is it? Lowercase u. You can see this kind of makes a little bit 3D. So again, this is just the overall aesthetics of our particular button. Now, something else that I want to do is I want to make sure there's no border around my button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do self.loadFileButton, and then there is this attribute called flat appearance. I hate spelling this word. Appearance. There is a border size property, which equals 0. Now, again, just to kind of, show you the documentation behind it, let's take a look and see if we can do it. So there's two kind of, I'm trying to think the way of describing it. There's kind of like two different objects. Like one's button base and one's button. Most of the things we need are down here under button, but then some of them are actually up here, and then some you won't see anywhere. And that's because it's being inherited from another object. So this is where I think probably most people will start getting confused, because you'll start going, well, what comes from what? But you just have to understand that sometimes it can be derived from other objects. And so there might not be things that are necessarily here that you can play with. And so just be a little bit forewarned. Sometimes you can be more than you can do more to an object than what you can, let on. And so here, I think that's the one we did. Was that border size? No, we did border size, but then there's border style that you could potentially do too. And there's just a lot. And so sometimes changing one thing can be done many different ways. So some is styles. Again, some are just getting everything here. So just be forewarned, you might be able to do things multiple ways. Don't be surprised if you're saying like, hey, this is giving me like a completely same result. Go for it. Now, the problem is when we remove our border, it still kind of has that hover effect, but the big problem is you can see like the size. I mean, you can't see it now. So we're going to just define some other things about it, and then we're going to add an event to our particular button. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to specify the text of our button. And so we're going to say self.loadFileButton. There's a text property, kind of like our form, and we'll just give it the text load assembly. Let's see what it looks like now. Okay, getting better. It's kind of small. I actually kind of like that font, but I'm going to change it. So that's apparently the system default font, which you would have guessed. So let's define some of our fonts. So define the font of our button. You know, it's interesting because if you ever came from a VBA world, this actually is not too different, because if we think about it, sometimes the property returns an object itself. And sometimes we take certain properties for granted because we think they're simpler than what they really are. And we don't actually understand that sometimes behind the scenes, like, it's actually a pretty complex object. I think font is one of those things where it's misleading. Like, most people think font is simple. Like, okay, it's just the style. But is it really? You have the height, you have the thickness, you have if it's bold or not, you have if it's italic or not, you have the name, you have the color, you have... So there's so much more to a particular object than can be let on. And so even though you think like, oh, there's not really much I could change about a font, there's a ton you could change about a font. And so for here, what we'll do is we will say well, actually, this is what we'll do. We'll define the font itself. So we'll say load file button, and then we'll just add on font at the end. And then for here, we'll go into the System.Drawing.Font. So this creates a new font object. We got to specify the name of our font. And so this is using one of the system fonts that you have downloaded if you have it. So I'm assuming that some of you will not have Roboto. In fact, I think most of you probably will not. So you can do other ones. You can do Arial. You could do Helvetica if you're on Apple, maybe. No, actually, you can't use this library on Apple, so forget about that. You could do Calibri if you want. I like Roboto. I think it's a cleaner font, and so I'm going to use that one. On top of that, we need to define the size of our particular font. And so we're going to go into our systems namespace. So system namespace. There is a single, which basically returns an int 32. And we say, hey, we want it to be a font 12, right? So it's going to be 12. And then it's going to be system.drawing. And then there is a font style, a enum. And then for that one, I want bold. And then I want to define the system drawing graphics unit. And then this one will be point. So a lot just to define a font, but you know, it is what it is. So then what we'll do is we'll call self.loadFileButton, and then we'll call the font property, which expects a font object. And then we'll do loadFileButton font. So this will change the font a lot, but all you're doing is you're just changing the font. So let's see what it looks like now. Okay, so it's a little bit cleaner. Bold now, it's bigger. Certain things you might not be able to remove, certain things you can. So let's go to our drawing. And if we go to F, there is a font. Okay, so it's a font class, so it's a class object. And then we see there's constructors. So this basically tells us how we can create our font. And so there's a font style. Here, I think this is the one that I was doing this one. So string, single, font style, and graphics unit. So if I get rid of the graphics unit, it will actually fail. So it won't let me build it. It will say there's an issue, I believe. So you sometimes just have to be a little bit careful about how you build it, because sometimes you think you can remove it and sometimes you can't. I encourage you to go to the constructors and seeing how you can actually build your font. There's many different ways to build a font. You don't have to specify every single attribute about it, but if you want more control over the process, then obviously that would be advantageous for you. All right, so now that we've done that, let's define the color of our button. Isn't this fun? Just literally making a button can be so time consuming. So we want the for color. So the for color is the color that the font will be. And so we'll say System.Drawing, and then there's a color. I think that's a color structure. And then there is from name. And then from here, I can just specify a name and we'll say white. Now, again, this is to highlight something. Still a structure, I'm just specifying a different method to create that structure. So this one's defining the for color. So that's the actual color of the font. Now I want the back color. And so the back color is the actual color of the button. And so we'll say System.Drawing.color. And then from here, we'll do from ARGB. And then we'll do 255, 69, and 90. And then we'll also have 100. So this is the actual color, the RGB values. And then this is saying I want it fully opaque. Again, notice up here, I didn't specify it. It's still fully opaque. Here I can technically do that as well. So just keep that in mind. Many different ways to sometimes do the same exact stuff. All right, let's run my terminal. Okay, looks good. Got a little bit of a hover effect here. That's kind of nice. Very cool. So what we'll do next is we're going to add an event to our particular button that will change the color when we hover over it. It's not going to look it's not going to look too different from what it currently is, but I'll make it a little bit more extreme so that way you can kind of see what's exactly happening, because you might want to say like, well, that doesn't look too different. Like, what did you actually change? But I do have to find where I put it. So many notes. Mouse leave, mouse enter. It should be there. Yeah, we'll wing it. What are we gonna do? Let's do this. We'll go down here and we'll define some events on our particular button. And so one of them will be define on, let me just copy just to be 100% safe. I don't want to screw up naming, because then if I screw up the name, it's going to drive me crazy. Okay. 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 So we're going to define a method. And with this particular method, we're going to give it the name load file button mouse enter. So when the mouse enters that particular button, we're going to use the self keyword because, again, we're still referring to that form. And then we're going to have a sender, so the one who's sending this information, and then the arguments of the information that was sent along when the message was sent to us. All we're doing is we're basically just modifying the values here. And I'm just simply adjusting this so that way it changes that information for us. And so what I probably could do if I wanted to is I could say maybe like 2%, right? So 2%, we've now defined our event, right? So we've defined our event using our method. And all we're saying is keep the font, this color the same, but change the back color. And when we change the back color, we just want like 2% of our original like color. So we're actually like making it really, really transparent. And so from here, what we're going to do is we will now bind that particular event to our particular object. So this is where things, again, might get a little confusing if you've never done it before, but trust me, it's not too bad. I promise you that. So we'll bind the events to our control. So we'll first go up here, and then we'll just have a little note here for ourselves. Bind events to control, okay. And then what we'll do is we'll do self.load file button, and there is a method called mouse enter, which basically binds well, it uses, I guess, this whole delegate that we can then use to subscribe to that particular event. At least that's how they do it. And then it's plus equal self.load file button. And then we have to define the particular, oh, sorry, I totally screwed this one up. I actually indented it a little bit too much, but it's load file button and then mouse enter. So that will subscribe to that event. So that will basically kind of bind everything together. And so now you can kind of see like it's actually, oh, interesting. Seems like the opposite effect. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe I'm thinking of it differently. So if I do 1 here, maybe this will like change it. Oh, no. Well, we'll see how it works in a sec. But basically, you're kind of getting the idea behind it. Is like you can bind your particular event to an object, but now we want it to change a little bit. So that way when we leave it, it's still going to be the same. So what we'll do is we'll say now mouse, I think it's mouse leave is the way I defined it. And then from here, really what we do is we just want it back to its original values. That's really all we want. And then so what we'll do is we'll now bind that event to our mouse object, or sorry, our button as well. So we'll do mouse leave and then leave. Okay, perfect, right? So I think at this point we have enough to kind of do everything we want. So here, define mouse enter event. So basically, what do you want to have happen when the mouse enters the button? Define mouse exit event. So again, what do you want to have happen when the mouse leaves that particular object? That's all we're doing with this event. We're saying, okay, when this event happens, what do you want to have happen? Right now, it's relatively simple, but what we'll do next is we'll do an on-click event. And so we'll say, okay, every time you click this button, we want you to go and fetch the file and parse some stuff about it, right? That's at least the general idea. And then all we need to do is, just because we have an event doesn't mean it's actually attached to our object. So we use the mouse enter method to basically subscribe to that particular event. And we're saying, okay, oh, sorry. And then what we're saying is, okay, during this event, this is what we want to have happen. If you want a little bit more information on it, I do think it's worthwhile read to kind of look at it. I think it's button base on mouse enter. Okay. Raise. Okay, so raising event maximum. Okay, yeah. Allows you to drive class. I don't know what it is, but anyway, so when you enter the mouse, it basically, this allows you to raise that event. So you're basically kind of like subscribing to it in essence. And so now if I run it, what do we get? Right? Okay, so this is a little bit better. It's kind of behaving more of what I was expecting. So, oh, kind of. Let me see if it's that one. So you can kind of see it's still changing it, but now it's going back to its normal color and everything like that. So kind of cool, right? Yeah, I think at this point, that's enough for this video. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below and I will try to get back to you. And then also, if you could, I'm trying to think what else. No, yeah, but yeah, if you have like any questions or things like that, you know, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. And then otherwise, I think in our next video, what we're going to be doing is adding our combo box. We're going to be adding our other button to it, and then we're going to be assigning some a little bit more complex functionality to our particular button, so that way it can do more things. But that's kind of what's lined up. And then again, as I kind of add more information to this, we'll start adding to it. So yeah, thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.